All right, let's jump right in. Every society has its rules, right? But actually enforcing those rules, well, that's one of the toughest jobs out there. Today, we are going to unpack a really radical new way of thinking about regulation, especially for governments that don't have a ton of cash to throw around. And that really brings us to the core question here. I want you to imagine something. Let's say you're a regulator. Your job is to keep these massive corporations in line, but you're totally outgunned. Your budget is a joke, your team is small. How on earth do you enforce the law when you're out of cash and maybe even out of luck? And look, this isn't just some academic thought experiment. This is the day-to-day reality for so many people out there. It's this constant balancing act, this tightrope they have to walk. And it's something we call the regulator's dilemma. So here's the trap they fall into. If you go in soft, try to persuade and cooperate, you risk looking like a total pushover. The bad actors will just walk all over you. But if you bring the hammer down with harsh punishments, that gets super expensive, it takes forever, and honestly, it can just make companies dig in their heels and fight you even harder. You're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. So what do you do? Well, it turns out there's a really elegant solution to this whole dilemma, proposed by a scholar named John Braithwaite. He came up with something called the responsive regulation pyramid. And trust me, it's a total game changer. The idea at its heart is actually pretty simple, but it's incredibly powerful. Instead of having just one tool, like a hammer, you have a whole toolbox. You adopt. You become responsive to how the company you're regulating is acting. Basically, their behavior dictates your next move. So here's how it actually works. You see this pyramid? You always start at the bottom, at the base. You begin with a simple, respectful conversation. You try to persuade them. If that doesn't work, okay, you go up one step. You issue a formal warning letter. If they still don't listen, you move up again to a civil penalty. And you keep escalating, step by step, all the way to the top. That big stick is always there, but you only use it as a last resort. What's so brilliant about this is how it combines three different ways of thinking about justice into one system. The bottom, the base, that's all about restorative justice. It's about talking, fixing the problem, and repairing any harm done. If that fails, you move into the middle, which is all about deterrence. You make it hurt financially, so it's just not worth it for them to break the rules anymore. And then at the very, very top, for the ones who just won't listen or are flat out incompetent, you have incapacitation. You just stop them. You take away their license to operate. It really does cover all the bases. And this is absolutely crucial. It's not a one-way trip to the top. The moment a company starts to play ball and cooperate, you immediately move back down the pyramid. You de-escalate. So the system is firm, for sure, but it's also forgiving. It rewards good behavior just as much as it punishes the bad, which makes the whole thing feel much more fair and legitimate to everyone involved. Okay, so this all sounds great, right? An elegant solution to a tough problem. But there's a catch. A big one. This whole model was basically designed for rich, well-funded countries. So what happens when you try to use this playbook in a place that just doesn't have those kinds of resources? Just take a look at this comparison. In developed economies, you have what academics call strong state capacity. All that really means is the government has the muscle to get things done. It's got well-funded agencies, a strong legal system, and this whole ecosystem of nonprofits and industry groups that help out. But in a lot of developing economies, that capacity is just weaker. The government has less money, the agencies are stretched thin, and that whole support network isn't really there. And that is the fatal flaw. The whole pyramid, the whole system only works because of the threat at the very top. That big stick is what makes companies cooperate down at the bottom. But here's the thing, actually using that stick, taking a company to court, revoking a license, that's incredibly expensive and complicated. It takes a strong state. If you don't have that credible threat at the peak, the whole pyramid kind of crumbles. It becomes a nice theory with no real teeth. And that's not just an academic problem. It has huge real-world consequences for everything from food safety to financial market. So, does that mean it's a lost cause for countries with fewer resources? Absolutely not. And this is where things get really, really interesting. We're going to look at two pretty radical ideas for how to rebuild this pyramid and make it work, even when the state is short on cash. Okay, solution number one is a total mind bender. It asks a simple question. What if, when a company misbehaves, you don't escalate the punishment from the state? What if you escalate the network of people who are watching them? This gives us a totally new kind of pyramid. So imagine a company isn't cooperating. Instead of the regulator saying, okay, now you get a bigger fine, they say, okay, now we're bringing in some friends. They escalate by pulling more and more partners into the mix to keep an eye on things. And who are these partners? Well, it could be almost anyone with a stake in the game. You're talking about big international NGOs. You could bring in powerful regulators from other countries, like the FAA in the US. You could call up investigative journalists. You could get industry associations involved. Heck, you could even escalate to the United Nations. All of a sudden, a small, underfunded regulator isn't alone anymore. They're the conductor of a global orchestra of oversight. All right, if you thought that was creative, get ready for solution number 2. This one is even more out there. The question is this: if the government can't afford to police corporate crime, what if you paid regular citizens to do it? What if you literally created a market for virtue? This happens through a fascinating legal tool called a quit tam lawsuit. It's a fancy Latin term, but here's what it means in plain English. It's a whistleblower lawsuit. If you're an employee and you know your company is ripping off the government, you can file a lawsuit against them on the government's behalf. And here's the kicker. If the case is successful, you get a slice of the money that's recovered. It is, and I'm not kidding, state-sanctioned bounty hunting for corporate fraud. So you might be wondering, does this crazy idea actually work? Well, get this. In the United States alone, since 1986, these kinds of lawsuits have recovered more than $12 billion for the government. No, that wasn't a mistake. 12 billion with a B. The truly fascinating part is what this does to the power dynamics inside a company. Think about it. It gives a massive financial incentive to the very people who know where the bodies are buried to come forward. In a way, you're outsourcing the government's detective work and turning senior-level employees into an army of potential enforcers. And that brings us full circle, back to our big central idea. You know, when we hear the word regulation, we usually picture a big, powerful government agency laying down the law. But maybe, just maybe, that's an old-fashioned way of looking at it. Could it be that the future of regulation is less about top-down state power and more about smart networks and empowered citizens? Is it possible that the best way to enforce the rules is to get more creative, more decentralized, and maybe even tap into the power of the market itself? It's a pretty radical thought, isn't it?